right. Okie dokie. We are live on Twitter Space and Twitch. So we're going to give it just a couple more seconds before we begin, and then we're going to have a grand old time doing this. All right, so we're looking at 8:27. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome back, PM Peeps, to PM Corner, where we learn about project management concepts and apply them to the real world. Happy New Year to all of you who are listening and viewing. And also, happy holidays. I know late, but thought I'd just mention it again. And so we're going to start with our concept, or really case study, of the year. So we're going to kick things off very explosively, if you know what I mean. If you are following me, of course, on Patreon, you would have known in advance what the subject would have been about. For those of you on Twitter Space, you will not see what I'm presenting. For those of you that are on Twitch, you already can see that our subject today is about the Manhattan Project. Now, of course, I'm going to say this before we even start, as I know some people have a little bit of some issues with the ethics of the Manhattan Project, particularly because of what occurred and also a lot of loss of life for sure. However, we just need to understand one thing. History is history, whether we like it or not. Okay? Unfortunately, history has shown to make some very dark decisions. And in addition to that, when you look at war, particularly, you see in the past, war has never been pretty, and it will continue to not be pretty. But what we can do as project managers is learn. Lessons learned, as we've always talked about every single time. Lessons learned. So, for this particular subject, we're just going to focus on what they did. How were they successful as a project? And we'll try and apply the concepts as well, as we've done with all the other previous projects. This one, however, we can kind of say is a moment where the government got their act together. That is for sure. I know we've looked at the Challenger space shuttle, we've looked at the FBI virtual case files, and we saw that, well, it was kind of questionable, right? Kind of iffy, and definitely a lot of taxpayer dollars gone to waste. But for the Manhattan Project, it was a very different situation. And it's very important to understand this because we're not trying to just look at only projects that fail. You got to look at also successful projects and understand what they've done because, again, lessons learned doesn't just come from bad projects or projects that failed or had to be redone 500 times like the virtual case files. They also come from projects that were successful. And we need to look at both to be well-rounded PMs. Now, of course, before I get started, I do want to say that if you like the content, you enjoy the content, you enjoy what's being discussed, how it's being discussed, please give a like, subscribe, and a follow on either Twitch, Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, or Patreon. If you also like to support the channel, please feel free to donate at PayPal or Patreon. Those links are available on my Twitch account. They're also available on my Linktree on my Twitter account. So if you're ever interested in that, that's awesome. Thank you so much, and it's much appreciated. Now, before I really get started, you're going to notice that there's not a timeline for this particular project because unlike the virtual case files where I showed you contingent moments in time where we start to see where the project kind of goes downhill, this project doesn't have that because, again, it's one of those that was, if we could put in quotes, successful. Just so that way people don't get a little upset. It was successful because there was a lot of scientific achievement, a lot of scientific discovery, and overall really contributed to science as we know it today, and especially in the beginning. But that's not the only thing we're going to talk about. Now, before I continue on, if you have any questions for me, please save them for the moments when I pause and say if you have any questions. Other than that, I'm not going to be seeing your comments more particularly as I have my script up to make sure that I stay on topic. Now, before we begin, this is a bit of a mentoring moment. You're probably wondering, okay, well, why are you going into so much depth about these projects and what's going on and how things are done and what are people doing and so on and so forth? Well, the reason is that in the PMBOK for the project manager, in order to be an integrator, and it's not really mentioned particularly, is that you need to understand your project. It's not just understanding your scope, as discussed in scope management. It's also understanding your project. You know, if your project has been done before but it kind of failed, what's the history? What was done in the past that maybe we should be avoided? You know, those kinds of questions need to be answered. You also need to understand a little bit of what's going to go into something as well. So, for technology, for example, you may notice that in Amazon, for example, they have technical PM positions where they tend to have a little more technical background. That's kind of important to understand a little bit of what your engineers are doing, how they're testing things, how they're developing, how they're building it, whatever the case may be. And the same thing goes for the PM. Now, does this mean you need to have a full blown degree in technology or engineering or physics, like for the Manhattan Project, as an example? No. But as a PM, to be the integrator that brings everyone together and all the processes together to work as a cohesive whole, you as a PM need to understand your project inside and out. Now, I know a lot of people may say, well, that sounds like a very high bar, but really it's not that high because if you really want to be successful, you need to understand what happens and what's going on. And it also includes who you're dealing with because remember in the initiating phase, we have to identify all our stakeholders, right? So in order to do that, we have to analyze, you know, the industry, who's impacted, who has interest, who doesn't, who's kind of neutral about it, and that's part of being able to understand your project is also your stakeholders. So not only are you trying to understand your stakeholders, not only are you trying to understand your business value of your project, you also need to understand your project and what it's supposed to do beyond the business value and how it's going to fulfill the business value. Now, of course, I know we're going to talk about the Manhattan Project, which can be debatable in terms of business value, but in the end, I think we can really identify it now, and I'm sure they did identify it even then, that there is business value in the fact that we've made major progress in the scientific discoveries. We made a lot of progress in understanding the atom, the understanding of fission, the understanding of other various concepts that maybe got disproven later. Those are things that really make a huge difference that we now see science and physics as of today. Now, of course, in terms of the ethics, there's a lot of issues that kind of will be discussed later, but that's not going to be the sole focus. Although I will mention this in the final thoughts about, of course, ethics. Now, with that said, before I begin, does anyone have any questions for me? Okay, I don't see anyone raising their hands or saying anything, so we're going to go ahead and continue on. So, first things first, we need to understand the scientific discoveries before we get into the project as a whole. Now, scientific discoveries started around 1890s and went all the way to like 1939 pretty much because in once we get closer to World War II, the Nazis and so forth, you start to see a lot more heavy investigation into the creation of the atomic bomb. But before we get even to how the atomic bomb came to be, we have to understand the discoveries that were done prior to that. So, of course, our first one is J.J. Thomas in 1897. He pretty much discovered the inner structure of the atom began with that of the electron. So what J.J. Thomson did is proved that the cathode rays were not some sort of identified process occurring in the ether, but were composed of small negatively charged particles. Now, of course, before him was Antoine Becquerel. He was French, and I probably butchered his name, so please forgive me. And he was the one that detected the three basic forms of radioactivity, which is later named by Ernest Rutherford, the alpha, beta, and gamma. Now, of course, in 1896, there was a French couple named Marie and Pierre Curie. They worked on the emissions of radiation by uranium and thorium, which, of course, they were proving that the beta particles were negatively charged. Now, of course, that's even before, J.J. Thomson, that's even before, well, that's actually at the same time as Antoine Becquerel, and then later named by Ernest Rutherford, which of course leading to that is Ernest Rutherford. Now, he had numerous discoveries. First off, in 1903, he proposed radioactivity was caused by the breakdown of atoms. So then, of course, 5 years later, he correctly identified alpha particles as being the nuclei of the atoms of helium. Then in 1911, so 6 years, well, okay, 9, 10. So 3 years later, he postulated that Hans Geiger that electrons orbited an atom's nuclei, which of course later we're going to get Niels Bohr, who worked with Max Planck's quantum theory. But of course, Rutherford was the first to kind of figure out what the atom kind of looked like and had his own explanation of it. And then of course in 1919 he reported a series of experiments that found nitrogen nuclei ejected what he suspected as a hydrogen atom. So those were some of his discoveries for the atom, which then leads to Niels Bohr. Now, of course, Niels Bohr took Rutherford's initial atom concept, where he was talking about, the alpha particles being the nuclei of the atoms, and then, of course, no, the electrons orbiting the atom nuclei, excuse me. So then, in a in taking Rutherford's initial atom concept, he then also combined that with Max Planck's quantum theory to produce the first modern model of the atom that we know today, which is with electrons, protons, neutrons, and then the nuclei in the middle, as you see in this picture, right? And so then in 1913, he demonstrated with this model that the electrons moved around the atom's nucleus in a certain discrete energy shell, and that radiation is emitted or absorbed when the electron moves from one shell to another. So that was really important. So then we lead into like the early 1930s, where the atom was thought to consist of positively charged nucleus containing both protons and neutrons, circled by a negatively charged electrons equal to in the number of the protons in the nucleus. And it was Chadwick's discovery of the neutron. And that's in 1932, that explained this mystery. Scientists found that the weight discrepancy between atoms of the same element resulted because they contained different numbers of neutrons. And I don't really remember how that math is done, and you probably don't either, or maybe you do. But, we talk in science class about number of neutrons, electrons, and protons and all that stuff. So these different classes of atoms of the same element but with varying numbers of neutrons were designated isotopes. So this is where we're starting to talk about uranium, which plays a role in the uranium atomic bomb. So, of course, there are three isotopes in the uranium found in nature. All have 92 protons in their nuclei, 92 electrons in orbit. You have uranium 238, which accounts for over 99% of natural uranium. That has 146 neutrons in the nucleus, compared with 143 neutrons in the rare uranium 235. So 235 does play a huge significant role later on, so keep that one in mind. They do, though, look at uranium 238 as well. And then, of course, 142 neutrons in the uranium 234, which is found in only traces in the heavy metals. The slight difference in atomic weight between the uranium 235 and 238 isotopes figured greatly in nuclear physics, which we talk about later when we start talking about the birth of the Manhattan Project and, of course, the implementation of the Manhattan Project. So then, of course, again, also in parallel in 1932, you had the Englishman Cockcroft and the Irishman Walton working jointly in the Cavendish laboratory, were the first to split the atom when they bombarded lithium with protons generated by a type of particle accelerator. They kind of dubbed it as the Cockcroft-Walton machine, and the change result in lithium nucleus with 2 helium nuclei. And also, Ernest Lawrence and his colleagues Stanley Livingston and Milton White successfully operated the first cyclotron at the University of California in Berkeley. So we're starting to try and see, like, what can we do with these atoms? How can we break them apart? Can we break them apart? How does this work? So again, this plays a huge role because now we're in the Great Depression. This is where we're starting to see the rise of course, Nazi Germany and Hitler. You also have, the world is kind of in a Great Depression just due to the fact of the market crashing and so forth. So this kind of is amazing that while we're in a downfall and kind of in a depressive era, we're also at the same time doing a lot of scientific and amazing discoveries at the same time. And then in December in 1938, you have Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann. Now, in 1938, this is where we're starting to get to really the height of Germany and the Nazis and them kind of going around and conquering and all this stuff. So Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, while bombarding elements with neutrons, discovered fission. So what they found is that while the nuclei of the most elements change somewhat during neutron bombardment, uranium nuclei changed greatly and broke into 2 equal pieces, which is where they discovered radioactive barium isotopes. And this is where fission, which is the basis of the atomic bomb, was discovered by Nazi Germany less than a year before the beginning of the Second World War. So this is where they're starting to get to their height and their peak and starting to do all the stuff that's going on. So imagine you already have someone with an ideology that's very questionable, first off. Secondly, that have not so good intentions. All of a sudden figuring this out, not a good idea. Now, of course, we're going to get to some information later that talks about the Nazis and so forth and why we were pursuing this and trying to get to this faster than them. But we'll get to that in a moment. Now, of course, with the discovery of fission, the possibility of a chain reaction completely altered the prospects for releasing the energy stored in the nucleus, and that there's a possibility of controlled self-sustaining reaction that could make possible to generate large amounts of energy for heat and power. But of course, they've also realized that unchecked reaction could create an explosion of huge force. So, with fission being understood and discovered now, you really have a lot of things that could be potentially possible. Now, of course, when we start talking about the Manhattan Project, there already was a lot of push for the atomic bomb, if I should kind of paint it that way. So now with the scientific discoveries, before we begin on the birth, does anyone have any questions for me regarding the initial discoveries? No? Okay. So we now move on to the birth of the Manhattan Project. So kind of a little tidbit information. The Manhattan Project was a code name for the research work that would extend across the country, which it did. It extended first to the universities, and then eventually you get to those sites that held the piles. And of course, well, the Los Alamos is kind of the biggest one because that's where they built the bombs. But the Manhattan Project was a code name. So we get to 1939. American scientists took a step to organize a project to exploit the newly recognized fission process for military purposes. So remember, the Nazis have already figured out fission, and you have all these scientists that are trying to escape Nazi Germany at this point, like Albert Einstein, all those guys. So they kind of already learned about this, and they're bringing this over to the United States, to us, and they're going, hey, we need to like get this going. So first government contact was made by G.B. Pigram, who arranged a conference in March of 1939. So he was trying to convince the U.S. government that, hey, this is kind of a big deal and we should really do this. However, Albert Einstein's fellow scientist convinced him to write a letter to Franklin D. Roosevelt to convince him of this. So this was in August of 1939, and he presented this military potential of an uncontrolled fission chain reaction. And Albert Einstein wrote his famous letter to help with the help of course, Slizard, who fled to the U.S. in the 1930s to escape Nazi and fascist repression, as well like Albert Einstein. So Slizard was the most vocal for advocating for the program based upon recent findings in nuclear physics and chemistry. So he was really pushing for this along with a few of other colleagues of Albert Einstein. But there are two key important items to take away from Albert Einstein's letter. So, of course, later it's going to be about the Nazis, but his particular letter was to approach government departments to keep them informed of the further development and put forward recommendations for government action, giving particular attention to the problem of securing a supply of uranium ore for the United States and to speed up the experimental work which is at present being carried on within the limits of the budget of university laboratories by providing funds, if such funds be required, through his contacts with private persons who are willing to make contributions for this cause, and perhaps also by obtaining cooperation of industrial laboratories which have necessary equipment. So nowhere in Albert Einstein's letter does he mention anything about the Nazis, because that's kind of a given later on once, of course, Roosevelt thinks about it. So Albert Einstein's letter, by the way, came in August of 1939. In October 11th of 1939, Alexander Sachs, Wall Street economist and longtime friend of FDR, met with the president to discuss this very letter. And Einstein informed the president of the recent research in chain reactions utilizing uranium, and it made it probable that large amounts of power could produce by harnessing the power to construct extremely powerful bombs. So he was kind of mentioning that. At the same time, too, Einstein did believe that the German government was actively supporting research in this area, which they were. Thanks for discovering fission in 1938, they were definitely pushing forward. And we're going to learn, too, just very briefly, about a mission that took place in 1943, which infiltrated the Nazis to figure out how far along were they in their, making of their atomic bomb. But of course, initially, when Sachs was talking to FDR, he seemed, initially non-committal and expressed concerns about necessary funds, which of course, who could blame him, right? So when we're talking in project management terms, FDR doesn't quite necessarily see the business value in the moment when Sachs met with him on October 11th. Okay, so he didn't seem to see the business value and what to be gained from this. Even though Albert Einstein's letter, which I highly recommend you go read, and I do have the source as a reference, you could read it, and it's pretty persuasive, and it really makes a good point about what needs to be done and of course why to pursue it. But eventually, though, by a second meeting with Sachs, FDR became convinced in the value of exploring atomic energy, which is really smart. Really good idea. So, of course, we've now identified our stakeholder, which is President Roosevelt, which later will also then be Truman, just based on circumstances. Roosevelt wrote back to Einstein on October 19th of 1939, informing the physicist that he had set up a committee consisting of civilian and military representatives to study uranium. So, of course, the events proved that the president was a man of considerable action once he had chosen a direction, which was true. He really was all about the Manhattan Project, and he supported it every step of the way. In fact, Roosevelt's approval of uranium research in October 1939, based on his belief that the United States could not take the risk of allowing Hitler to achieve unilateral possession of extremely powerful bombs, was merely the first decision among many that ultimately led to the establishment of the only atomic bomb effort that succeeded in World War II, the Manhattan Project, which, as I said, is true. So there was a little bit of a, oh, well, if the Nazis are starting to figure this out, we need to get our act together. So, of course, he establishes a bunch of committees. He establishes all these efforts, funding, you name it, which we're going to get into in the implementation. Now, of course, in 1940, German scientists were working on a similar project as well as the British in exploring the problem of creating a atomic bomb. 1939 and early 1940, France made important research on fission too and the feasibility of chain reactions using uranium. However, okay, because 1938, so again, connect the dots. 1938, fission was discovered. So 1939 or early into 1940, France was starting to really start looking into this. But unfortunately, France fell under German occupation in 1940. So, of course, all that had to stop. The British made significant theoretical contributions early in the war, but did not have the resources to pursue a full fledged atomic bomb research program and acceded to the US to take the lead. Because, again, too, at that point, you had Nazi Germany, at some point bombing England, trying to get them to, surrender in a sense. And so, what time are you going to have when you're too busy fighting a war, right? Same thing with France. Germany seemed to kind of have a little bit of a slowdown too, because they were just so focused on conquering and fighting and so forth that when we get, of course, to the mission that we discuss in 1943, that's where we kind of see that, okay, they really didn't make much progress in the first place. Now, before I continue on, does anyone have any questions for me in the regards of the birth of the Manhattan Project? No? Okay. So now moving on to the implementation of the Manhattan Project. So this is where we're going to break it down by year. So we're going to go from 1940 all the way to 1945. So 1940, here we go. So in February of 1940, $6,000 was made available to start research under the supervision of the committee. So it was the Uranium Committee headed by L.J. Briggs. Okay, so the Uranium Committee's first report in November of 1939 recommended that the government should immediately obtain 4 tons of graphite and 50 tons of uranium oxide. Because even though it wasn't clear yet if this would be successful or if this would be potentially achievable, you know, that's where things get a little bit hectic in that regard. But they still had made the choice to start purchasing this stuff, figuring out whether they need to, you know, do what they need to do. But also at the same time, there's a lot more research that's going into particularly uranium and plutonium. But we're going to talk about that, especially through 1940 to 1943 a little bit. We do a lot of research into this because we need to figure out, is this really possible? All that research, by the way, takes place first in the universities. So all these universities, so if you go to major websites that talk about the Manhattan Project, particularly the Department of Energy and their Office of History and Heritage Resources, which they have this interactive site, they tell you about these different locations and they show you. So all these universities, which is where all these scientists were at, they were doing all the research there, and eventually they got to a point where they had to make a decision. And that's where we're going to get to in about 1942, end of 1942 into 1943 and 1944. So, which of course it reflected on the importance to attach to the Fermi Slizer's pile reactor. So when they were, collecting the graphite and the uranium, this was more about the plutonium aspect. Which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, before I continue on, I'm not going to get too deep into the science. It's a lot of complicated talk, not jargon, but there's a lot that goes into it. And though, as I said, we do need to understand how a project works. Again, we're not trying to be physicists without a degree. We are trying to just understand overall what they had to do to make this work. Okay? Because, again, we're not the physicists. We are the project managers that are trying to help the physicists get what they need so they can be able to do what they need to do. So, of course, in the importance of the pile reactors, which it does play a huge role, by the way, Fermi and Slizard increasingly focus their attention on carbon in the form of graphite. Perhaps graphite could slow down or moderate the neutrons coming from the fission reaction and increasing the probability of their causing additional fissions and sustaining the chain reaction. So that's the thing that they needed to see is through fission how long they can maintain the reaction, right? Because you're talking like all these neutrons are starting to, kind of break out or explode in essence. That I'm trying to explain science in a non-scientific way, so sorry. So they need to do further experimentation to really see if this is doable so that you can make a bomb out of it. So a pile containing a large amount of natural uranium could then produce enough secondary neutrons to keep the reaction going. So then, in the early 1940s, only months after the outbreak of war in Europe, the Uranium Committee recommended that the government fund limited research on isotope separation, as well as Enrico Fermi's and Slizer's work on fission chain reactions in Columbia University. So that's where that $6,000 went into all that research first, just to kind of get an understanding of a better understanding and more conclusions, right? Because now all this research, by the way, is going to play a huge role in the determination of how to move forward. Okay. So, of course, it was concluded that uranium-235 was necessary for further research and that the isotope might serve as a fuel source for explosive device. And so here's the thing. They looked at uranium 235, as I said. That was very important, which is it's a rare chemical in there. The thing was is that they knew that they discovered that uranium 235 and 238 were similar in chemical composition, and so they could not be separated by chemical means. So now the question becomes how to separate them. So this leads into isotope separation. So there were kind of two options at this point. Okay, only two so far. High speed centrifuge, so it's kind of like a cream separator. Think of that principle. It's, you're kind of spinning in, spinning in, spinning in to get it to separate, and slowly the items would separate over time. Then there's gaseous diffusion. Now, this is based on the well known principle that molecules of lighter isotopes would pass through a porous barrier more readily than molecules of a heavier one. And this approach proposed to produce a myriad repetitions as gas increasingly riches the uranium 235 as the heavier uranium 238 was separated out of the system in cascades. Okay, so that's kind of what the gaseous diffusion. I know that sounds a little technical, but that's kind of the point of it. Now, in the spring and summer of 1940, then they discovered liquid thermal diffusion that was most significant. So into the space between two centric vertical pipes, what they did is Abelson placed pressurized liquid uranium hexafluoride, with the outer wall cooled by a circulating water jacket and the inner heated by high pressure steam. The lighter isotope tended to concentrate near the hot wall and the heavier near the cold. Convection would in time carry the lighter isotope to the top of the column. So that's kind of how they figured that one out. They discovered the liquid thermal diffusion. Then by June of 1940, Roosevelt, while all this research is going on, okay, while all this is going on, Roosevelt transfers the Uranium Committee to a newly created National Defense Research Committee, or also known as the NDRC, and this falls under Vannevar Bush first. Okay, so Vannevar Bush is the first to kind of lead all this effort. So, retaining programmatic responsibilities for uranium research in the new organizational setup, the Uranium Committee recommended that all four isotope separation methods and the chain reaction work continue to receive funding for the remainder of 1940. Okay, so even though they had this kind of committee switch, they still thought to keep this going and they still thought to say, okay, we need to continue on and see what is the best solution. Now, again, all this research, and I'm emphasizing, does play a role into the decision later. Now, you would think that during all this research, there'll be a lot of risk analysis, right? Now, this is where, and I'm going to talk about more, this is where I think Agile would have been deeply in love with the Manhattan Project, just on how parallel all the efforts were, because the research for uranium was in parallel, the research for plutonium was in parallel, all of this, discovering of the different types of isotope separation techniques and so forth were also in parallel due to these research efforts. So you're talking something that Agile would have absolutely loved. Now, the thing is, too, is because there's unknown unknowns, there would have been the ability to constantly make a lot of shifts and movements, which is also true. And there was a lot of shifting and moving and kind of a lot of back and forth on what would be the better technique to make the atomic bomb. And a lot of the times, too, these scientists were trying to really prove their theory, or however you want to call it, a theory or hypothesis on what would be the best solution. Now, I saw some of one resource that tried to make it seem as though there was a lot of ego involved. It didn't sound like it from the research the deeper research I did. It didn't seem as though there was a lot of ego involved. It was just kind of more like, what is the best solution, because we're trying to find this out and we're trying to get this figured out as quickly as possible so that we can quickly proceed in building out, this bomb that we're going to use, right? Now, of course, we get through 1940 and then we get into the year 1941. So, experiments conducted in early 1941 at the Radiation Laboratory at the University of California finally completed the link between pile research and bomb construction. So Edwin McMillan and Philip H. Abelson, remember Abelson was kind of mentioned earlier in 1940, had been studying uranium fission fragments produced by the cyclotron, um, which was also mentioned as a discovery in the earlier section. So remember, the cyclotron was mentioned to kind of do a separation, right? Their research led to the chemical identification of element 93, which is neptunium, while research by Glenn T. Seaborg revealed that the isotope of neptunium decayed to yet another transuranium, which is a man-made element, based on what the cyclotron did. So in February, Seaborg identified this as as element 94, which he later named plutonium. By May, he had proven that plutonium 239 was 1.7 times more likely than uranium 235 to fission. So this is where, again, I was telling you about this not competition, but this parallel, what is the better solution, comes into play. So we have uranium, and we already knew about uranium. We had uranium in the past. We knew what uranium was, but now we've found plutonium. This finding made Fermi Slizer's experiment more important than ever, as it suggested the possibility of producing large amounts of fissionable plutonium in a uranium pile while using plentiful uranium-238 and then separating it chemically. So they were good. So the whole Plyle thing that we were talking about in the 1940s that was being funded and continuing on, that one is where that played into the role with plutonium. Now, the most influential study came later on in the year that really made, I want to say, a real shift in the decision. So the Maud report, which, by the way, Maud was mistaken at first to be some kind of code name. It was later realized by Neil. It was by Niels Bohr, who sent this letter to a colleague, and he mentioned three names, one of which being Maud, and it was kind of later discovered that it was about a governess who taught his children and then moved to England. But the Mao Report does have a huge influence. So the Mao Report contains plans for producing a bomb drawn up by a distinguished group of scientists with high credibility in the U.S. The report dismissed plutonium production, thermal diffusion, the electromagnetic method, and the centrifuge. And instead it called for the gaseous diffusion of uranium-235 on a massive scale. So we get the plutonium and we're going, oh, well, hey, wait a minute. The piles that we're already doing, research on for uranium, we can pull the plutonium out through a chemical separation if we get plentiful amounts of uranium-238. The Maud report comes through and goes, no, no, no. Dismiss that. gaseous diffusion of uranium-235. So then, of course, after the Mound Report, you get to November 6th, which is 1 month and a day before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which was December 7th of 1941, which brought the United States into World War II. Concluded that a critical mass of between 2 and 100 kilograms of uranium-235 would produce a powerful fusion bomb, and that for 50 to 100 million dollars of isotope separation, sufficient quantities could be accomplished. So they realized this in November, that the critical mass of between 2 and 100 milligrams of uranium-235 would produce a powerful fission bomb, and the price tag for it, which was 50 to 100 million, could be accomplished. So the thing was too, throughout all the research, was concern about cost. Cost was a constant concern. But eventually, with the fact that they had to come to a final conclusion of, okay, well, what do? We got to move forward. We can't keep researching because, oh my God, the Nazis may have figured it out and already get a bomb, and then what are we going to do? So that eventually came to a halt, and eventually it was just like, I don't care how much this costs. I don't care how much we got to pay. Get it done. So with the conclusion of 1941, we get into 1942. So of course, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. So we are, eventually taken out of isolationism and have to become part of the war. And so with the U.S. entering World War II, the War Department was given joint responsibility for the project. Now, of course, while we had um, defeats in the Pacific, because not only were we in Europe fighting the Germans alongside with the British and the French, we were also fighting the Japanese. So we were doing a lot of the island hopping, a lot of the many defeats in the Pacific. So at the same time, uranium bomb could be achieved if sufficient uranium-235 could be produced by one or more of the three methods. So we're back to deciding on the methods again. So gaseous, centrifuge, or electromagnetic. And a plutonium bomb might prove a quicker route, but it required demonstration that plutonium could be produced in the uranium pile, then be separated in usable quantities. Now, before I continue on, I am going to let you know that that really at the end, in the research, and I didn't put this in my notes, but in the research, it seems as though they were really having a hard time proving the plutonium piece. And they were having lots of failures, a lot of errors, a lot of issues, but they kept pushing for it because they were like, this has to be the better option and the faster option than the uranium. But again, do not forget that in the process of this, we were also continuing to do research in uranium. So this is why we had the parallel efforts, because we couldn't just stop on one and then switch to the other. That just didn't make sense. So then moving on, it was obvious by the mid 1942 that the need for pilot plants, laboratories, and manufacturing facilities would have to be constructed to carry out the mission. So the program review was conducted in May of 1942, determining no front runner in the race for the bomb existed, and all three methods and piles should be pushed as fast as possible to be used. So they determined that because you still had to figure out, okay, well, what worked better for uranium, and you still had all this research and testing for plutonium. So now the government's just like, okay, we're just going to have to try all three, and we're just going to have to see what's the best option. And so in June of 1942, we had the Corps of Engineers Manhattan District was initially assigned to the management of the construction work, right? Because we had to start building all these laboratories, right? We had to start building stuff. And in the spring of 1942, the Bomb Research and Development Laboratory in the Los Alamos started building. Now remember, I know there are other locations, and yes, we also have all the universities, but the Los Alamos location is the most important because this is where later we get the Trinity test. Now, we'll talk about that when we get into 1945. But Keep in mind, Los Alamos, very important location. Then by September of 1942, General Leslie Groves was placed in charge of all Army activities, mainly the engineering activities. Now, things were kind of not moving fast enough. Typical of the government, they always go, I want it done and I wanted it done yesterday, so where is it? I want it now. So with that, they decided to put Groves in charge, which he was, based on the research, was very respected. He was pretty much a get-a-doner, get things moving, get things going. And it says here even that Leslie Groves moved swiftly to make good on his new timetable by scheduling a decisive meeting of the Military Policy Committee for November 12th of 1942 and of the S1 Executive Committee for November 14th. So there was an S1 committee that was for I think it was for the plutonium or the uranium, I can't really remember. There were so many committees and so much information. It was kind of like, I'm trying to make this understandable in more of a timeline format versus trying to throw a bunch of information. But he was making sure that he could get something going. And the scientists at each of these institutions doing isotope separation research knew these meetings would determine the uranium-235 separation method would be used in the bomb project. Therefore, the keen competition among the institutions added to the sense of urgency created by the war. So, yeah, I know that that wording kind of says competition, but we also have to remember they were trying to find the best solution. And I'm going to keep harping on that till the end, till I'm blue in the face. So then by November of 1942, the path to the bomb was via plutonium, not uranium, as plutonium seemed the most promising. And then by December 28th, 1942, President Roosevelt approved what ultimately became a government investment more than $2 billion, which is a lot of money. $2 billion is a lot of money. 0.5 billion of that being itemized. So that's talking like all the things they need to build stuff and get things going. Which I'm not going to lie, I do remember kind of looking at a different source, which I didn't really use, but they did kind of mention that if the scientists came and said we need more money, Roosevelt had no issue with it. Roosevelt just went for it and said, yeah, no problem, here's more money. In fact, I also it wasn't confirmed though by the main sources I used, but some other sources did say that Roosevelt did kind of go around Congress as well, which yeah, that's very interesting politics he played there, but to the benefit of the project. Now, moving on from 1942 into 1943. So we get the Los Alamos laboratory built up. So Grove selects Oppenheimer as head of the Los Alamos laboratory. And in the first 3 months of 1943, he tirelessly put together a team of first rate staff and proved to be highly successful because by mid-March of 1943, recruits began arriving from universities across the United States, including California, Minnesota, Chicago, Princeton, Stanford, Purdue, Columbia, Iowa State, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, while others came from the Met Lab and the National Bureau of Standards, which the Met Lab is another location. It's one of the major three. So Los Alamos and the Met Lab are like the two major ones. And there's a third one, I don't remember the name. But again, Los Alamos is the most important because while all the research was going on in the universities and Met Lab and so forth with the piles, all of that was getting sent to the Los Alamos location so that they could build the bomb. So, virtually overnight, Los Alamos became an ivory tower frontier boomtown as scientists and their families, along with the particle accelerators and other experimental equipment, including two Van de Graaff generators, a Cockcroft Walton machine, and a cyclotron, arrived caravan fashion at the Santa Fe Railroad Station and then made their way up to the mesa along the single primitive road. So, this becomes a big deal. So now we're starting to say, okay, time to start getting there. Now, we're in 1943, guys. So now we're talking about the ALSOS mission. This mission was about infiltrating what was going on with the Axis powers, mainly with Nazi Germany. So, in September of 1943, Allied invasion of Italy as part of the Manhattan Project mission to coordinate foreign intelligence related to enemy nuclear activity. So that's what this whole project was about. So the assignment was for the search for personnel, records, materials, and sites, and evaluate the above programs and prevent their capture by the Soviet Union. So, of course, remember, the Soviet Union wasn't really part of all this. They were kind of not happy with Germany. At least that's what I remember from history class. So, of course, we're kind of going, we don't want them to have this either. Now, before I continue on, I will say that there was a mention of espionage, which would have been interesting to look into, but from a project management perspective, as part of your risk analysis, you would have already kind of, try to make efforts to protect this information. And in the research, they did try their due diligence to really protect what was going on, who was where, who was doing what we were learning, what we were discovering, all that stuff. So the government was trying to do their due diligence, but unfortunately, espionage does happen. It's unfortunate. You get disgruntled people, you get people who just don't think about, the consequences, and therefore they start sharing things with, enemies that end up getting their hands on it. Um, and of course, this leads into, other issues later on, like when we have the Cold War, right? Which comes long after. But of course, what they discovered in the ALSOS mission is that Germany couldn't really, it's not get their act together, but they couldn't figure out how to make it work in a scheduled way, like a very structured way of building the bomb. So as you see with the Manhattan Project, you've got all this parallel activity going on. You've got so much happening, so much going on all at once. And the Nazis were trying to make it more structured, which, if any of us has done any kind of science experiment in any way, it's not really that structured. Yes, you still have a structure of, this is what I'm testing, this is what I'm trying to achieve, this is how I did it. But what you do is kind of not that structured in an essence. And so they kind of realize, okay, we're a bit ahead of not the Nazis, so we're pretty much fine. But using the atomic bomb against Germany changes, of course, and it goes more towards Japan, but we talk about that a little later. So now, of course, we get done with 1943, we get into 1944. So in late 1944, Los Alamos began to shift from research to development of the bomb production. Increased production at Oak Ridge and Hanford seemed to promise that enough plutonium and enriched uranium would be available for at least one bomb using each. Originally, as I said, aimed for Germany, but by the summer of 1944, the government had their sights set on Japan. So remember, as mentioned earlier, Japan was really defeating us on all fronts. We were just getting hammered like crazy. Unlike with Europe, where we came in, we kind of were able to dominate. We weren't really able to do so much with Japan. But again, that's kind of a difference of culture. That's also a difference in mentality and how they were in terms of battle. So it's very, very different. Very destructive too, and just kind of crazy. So as a result of the progress at Oak Ridge and metallurgical and chemical refinements on plutonium that improved implosion chances, the 9 month between July 1944 and April of 1945 saw the American bomb project progress from doubtful to probable, which was awesome. Now, of course, I don't talk about all the reactors, but the main reactor that kind of kicks off all this production to build these bombs that's getting sent back to the Los Alamos was in September of 1944. B reactor was complete and began functioning. Now, of course, there was a bit of some issues as there was xenon poisoning, which caused several months of delay. Which, by the way, not a really good thing. Which, as part of your risk assessment, right, you probably would have wanted to go potential poisoning, death, health risks, etc. But that's the thing. You had so much unknown. You just had to take the risk. Now, of course, should they have documented that? Most certainly. Anyone who, when you're dealing with something new that you're not really sure about, you kind of want to really make sure that you account for everything, right? Because risk management is part of your cost and your budget, because if you don't set aside enough reserves to manage your risks, you're going to have problems. And thank goodness for the Manhattan Project, that didn't really cause too many issues. But as you see, that would have been one of those risks that would have been accounted for. And, if they knew how to better react potentially. Now, they may not have had a solution, but a temporary solution would have been probably wise. But again, how would you know with, playing with chemicals? But by February of 1945, the first plutonium produced by B factor was on its way to Los Alamos, which then, of course, all the other reactors that got built, all the other piles, right? They started producing too, and they started sending, of course, all their material to Los Alamos so they can start building the bombs, which then leads into 1945. So there was an August 1st delivery date of the Little Boy uranium bomb, because there was Little Boy and Fat Man. Remember that from history class. Certainly appeared more likely than it had when Groves briefed George Marshall. There would be no implosion weapons in the first half of 1945 as Groves had hoped, but developments in April boded well for the scheduled summer test of the Fat Man plutonium bomb. Now, I didn't mention this in the notes because it was kind of interesting. They wanted to build a gun, like actual weapons. Which was really interesting. I didn't really try to get into it too much because it just got very technical. And of course, I'm sitting there going, whoa, you guys were trying to do some crazy stuff with all this, plutonium and uranium and so forth. So it was very fascinating, though. But eventually, they kind of had to give up that effort and just focus on the bombs themselves. Robert Oppenheimer chose the name Trinity test. So, of course, quality management, right? We need to make sure that things get tested before you just start using them. And especially when you don't have a clue about what the consequences might be. So, of course, they were going to test, they made 3 bombs, according to my research, and they were going to test one of them. And this is where Oppenheimer chose the name Trinity, as the name was inspired by the poems of John Donne. And they chose a remote corner in Alamogordo bombing range known as the Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of Death, which was 210 miles south of Los Alamos. So they were going to pick a place that was really remote and all that stuff. Now, before I read verbatim from the Department of Energy, Office of History and Heritage Resources quote of what happened at 5:30 a.m., there was a lot of concern about doing this test. Obviously, the question became, what was going to be the impact? And would it be the end of the city or the end of the world? Because no one had a clue, which again is another risk. And so I saw in my research there was a little bit of a bet that was made of, what would happen, what was the potential. Now, of course, they wanted a successful explosion, but what was the consequence of it? They weren't sure. But as reads, the test was at precisely 5:30 a.m. on Monday, July 16th, 1945. The nuclear age began. While Manhattan Project staff members watched anxiously, the device exploded over the New Mexico desert, vaporizing the tower and turning the asphalt around the base of the tower to green sand. Seconds after the explosion came a huge blast wave and heat searing out across the desert. No one could see the radiation generated by the explosion, but they all knew it was there. The steel container Jumbo, weighing over 200 tons and transported to the desert only to be eliminated from the test, was knocked ajar even though it stood half a mile from ground zero. As the orange and yellow fire bars stretched up and spread, a second column narrower than the first rose and flattened into a mushroom shape, thus providing the atomic age with a visual image that has become imprinted on the human consciousness as a symbol of power and awesome destruction. Now, of course, once that test took place, it was a sigh of relief because it didn't mean the end of the world. But they were all very excited. And Groves was just cheering, just awestruck and excited. And there were lots of reports sent to Truman at this time. So now we're at President Truman. And all the excitement around the success of the test, what had happened, and then there were months later, a little while later, a little more information about what happened and so forth. And of course, with the success of this test, the final decision to drop the atomic bomb when it was made the following day was July 25th, was decidedly anticlimactic. Which I don't know if I would disagree with it being anticlimactic. Because again, as a project manager, you have to think about risks. You have to think about what are the impacts of these risks, right? And obviously, this was not going to be a very pretty impact. As I said in the very beginning, war is ugly. And this gets very ugly. But so when I mentioned that the attention turned from Germany to Japan, here are some things. So they were talking about trying to do alternatives with Japan. So the only alternative to the atomic bomb that Truman and his advisors felt was certain was to lead Japan to a surrender was an invasion of the Japanese home islands. So they were considering this. So they weren't trying to be like, yeah, let's just bomb them. No. They were like, okay, well, hold on. This needs to be a backup. We need to find an alternative way. And so plans were already well advanced for this, with the initial landings were set for the fall and winter of 1945. So they were planning this. They were kind of going, we may need to invade. No one knew how many lives would be lost in the invasion, American, Allied, and Japanese, but the recent seizure of the island of Okinawa provided a ghastly clue. So, as I said, we're fighting in the Pacific and we are getting defeated left and right. Now, I don't know much a whole lot about the Pacific part of World War II, but it's pretty gruesome. I mean, you're talking a group of people that were they did not know what surrender meant. It was either die in battle honorably or conquer and take over. So, when you got that kind of mindset, who knows what can be done that's ghastly. And because of the island of Okinawa, they saw and they were kind of like, ooh, I don't know about this. I don't know about this invasion. I mean, you're talking we're only fighting small groups on islands. Imagine a whole entire country. So the campaign to take the small island had taken over 10 weeks, so this was about the island of Okinawa, and the fighting had resulted in the deaths of over, ready, 12,000 Americans, 100,000 Japanese, and perhaps another 100,000 native Okinawans. So take that and then expand that. So you would think there'd be a lot of hesitancy of doing an invasion like that. Now, I'm not saying there was justification to just go to the bomb, but you do have people kind of thinking about this a little bit and being like, ooh, weigh my options. What's the better option? And that's the other thing about being a project manager that the PMBOK doesn't really talk about. You, as a project manager, have to make a lot of decisions. And sometimes those decisions are not the easiest. And sometimes you may get villainized for taking a decision that, though may have resulted in, I don't want to say a better result, but resulted in less of a casualty and kind of avoiding a much bigger, more exacerbated situation. But still, when you're kind of left with, we got this bomb, we know it's going to do a massive destruction, or we go invade a country and face higher casualties. But though they were thinking this, Japan was making efforts to end the war by going through the Soviet Union. So there was some kind of effort. Now, of course, if we kind of remember with Pearl Harbor, we did have a Japanese diplomat that was here, right? And of course, they kind of blindsided us, and they were kind of two-facing us in an essence. I'm grossly simplifying that, but that the point is that obviously they weren't really willing to make a real effort. And just by the fact that Japan was going through the Soviet Union to talk to the US, that was kind of a no-no. But with them doing that, we kind of already knew because we intercepted numerous communications. And as also quoted from the Department of Energy, Office of History and Heritage Resources. From the replies these diplomats received from Tokyo, the United States learned that anything Japan might agree to would not be a surrender so much as a negotiated peace involving numerous conditions. These conditions probably would require, at a minimum, that the Japanese home islands remain unoccupied by foreign forces and even allow Japan to retain some of its wartime conquests in East Asia. So remember, this is Japan who also invaded China, which is part of all of this. Many within the Japanese government were extremely reluctant to discuss any concessions, which would mean that a negotiated peace to them would only amount to little more than a truce, where the Allies agreed to stop attacking Japan. After 12 years of Japanese military aggression against China and over 3.5 years of war with the United States, begun with the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, American leaders were reluctant to accept anything less than a complete Japanese surrender, which is also another issue. Now, I know this is not about the building of the atomic bomb because this kind of comes after we've kind of figured this out. But it plays a role in all of this. And again, war is ugly. War will always continue to demonstrate how ugly it will be. And it's an unfortunate part of humanity. And so, of course, Japan publicly rejected a Potsdam Declaration, which, so the Soviet Union, the US, and the British, because I did see a picture of Winston Churchill that was kind of part of this, they were trying to make this deal where they would kind of stop all this, but Japan had to fully surrender, and Japan was just refusing 100%. So on July 25th, 1945, Truman gave the order to drop the bombs. And so leads into August 6, 1945, the bombing of Hiroshima, and August 9th of 1945, the bombing of Nagasaki, which then led to Japan surrendering from between August 10th and 15th of 1945. Now, of course, before I get into my final thoughts, let me see. I want to offer. Oh, okay. So I just stopped to look at the first chat. Uh, I might consider it. But thank you for the offer. Um, any questions in regards to what I talked about for the implementation portion of the Manhattan Project before I go into final thoughts about project management, how this applies, and even talking about a little bit of the ethics? Okay, so here are my final thoughts. Let me begin first with the fact that the Manhattan Project is not a typical project. You would see that in the PMBOK, it would say project management has always been traditional or quote unquote waterfall. And that project management has never been flexible. Project management can't do this, blah, 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 blah. But we tend to forget a project like the Manhattan Project, where this wasn't done in a quote unquote traditional way. This is more than that. This is a project that demonstrated that it is possible to be flexible. Extremely. I mean, this is why the Nazi Germans couldn't get an atomic bomb, because they were trying to structure it too much. Whereas the United States government allowed the scientists to do what they needed to do all the research and discovery and knowing what they needed and giving them the resources they needed to make this happen. And so every time I hear the knocking against project management, I'm going to be a little frank here. It's kind of unfortunate, and it kind of shows. Um, and this is why this channel is here, is not just to show projects that have failed, it's also to show projects that are successful and efforts that are successful. The other thing too is, again, I'm giving some positives before we get into ethics. This is a demonstration of where people come together because they all collectively understand the business value. And unlike the FBI virtual case files, where you really didn't have a cohesive team that understood the business value, understood why we're doing this, and you had people that had their own ideas about things, and look what happened. Things got out of control. You had out of control budgets, delays, issues, failures, defects, problem after problem after problem after problem. Manhattan Project here just demonstrates how everyone understood the assignment. Kind of like the TikTok trend where I think like 2 years ago, where they're like, I understood the assignment. They understood the assignment. And so this is where the team comes together. Now, in terms of ethics, the PMBOK does briefly mention ethics and how to be ethical as a project manager, but here's the thing, and this is my best advice I can give. You always just have to do the right thing. Now, can I really say that the bombing of Japan was the right thing to do? Well, I don't know. I'm going to be honest on that. I don't know. I wasn't there. I just have the information I have. But if I were to kind of think about it, when I was reading the part about the capturing of the island of Okinawa, I thought of the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise. And at the end, where they're fighting the newly formed, like westernized Japanese government, and the samurais were fighting, all I thought of was the guy who got stabbed. And yet, he continued on killing, even though he got stabbed and was spitting blood. So you have to imagine what you're up against. And that's something that philosophically Sun Tzu, The Art of War, talks about, where you're needing to understand your enemy. And I think in the moment of when they were able to capture Okinawa, I think that's when the US government, had a realization of, oh man, this is our enemy. And that's why they were trying to have the negotiations of surrender. So I think they did what they thought in their mind was the right thing to do, which was avoiding higher amounts of casualties from war. And though unfortunately, as we have seen now, these atomic bombs have very devastating impacts. There are other projects that I found later, while I was doing this research, like Project Sunshine. That one's a little controversial, but you can just look that up yourself. But in summary of that one, that's where they kind of did research into the effects of afterwards, and that one was pretty grisly in my mind. And I'm not going to talk about that one, but you can look that one up for yourself and kind of see what it's about. But in the end, they had the information they had at the time. And again, like even with the Trinity test, they kind of had to take a risk and say, okay, we don't know what this is going to result to, but we got to try. But as I will always state, always do the right thing, no matter what. I don't care if it's, if it's one of those moments where politically someone's going to look at you and go, you weren't politically savvy about that, or you get demonized for it. But doing the right thing is always important and it's vital. Even in your personal life, even if you don't take any go into project management, this is one of those things that you need to do is always the right thing. And with that said, I'm also going to show my references here. So of course, again, if you like the content, please give a follow. Please subscribe. I'm on, Twitch, obviously. Thank you for also subscribing, following me. The Vinsanity 521 FSB, much appreciated. I do see your chat here, so I might take a look at it and consider. In addition to that, if you also like to support the channel through donations, that would also be great. The PayPal link and Patreon. I will mention that Patreon does have better options. It has more benefits. So do take a look at it. It's the same logo, same banner. I try to keep everything consistent so that you know it's the same. So it's basically me. Um, Please do consider. It'll be great. I do appreciate you joining. And with that said, Happy New Year and can't wait to see you in the next 2 weeks. Thanks.